Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Book of Refugees podcast. Today, I'm joined by Alice Richardson, a PhD student in the Department of Language and Linguistics at the University of York. Hi, Alice. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Hugh. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So, Alice, I believe your background is in forensic linguistics.
Yeah.
For your PhD, you researched interpretation in the asylum process in the UK?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
A bit of background for people who may not be aware of this. The asylum process in the UK. In 2016, the contract for providing interpretation and translation services in the UK's Ministry of Justice was transitioned from Capita TI. Now, that name might be familiar to listeners because they were victims of a huge cybercrime in 2023. And it was transferred to the successful bidder, which is a Leeds-based language service provider called The Big Word. With that in mind, over to you, Alice. Would you like to tell us more about your PhD?
Yeah, thank you. So I used to work as a caseworker for an immigration law firm, and I was responsible for people who had been refused asylum, and so submitting new applications for them. And through talking to these clients and talking to colleagues, I saw an issue with interpreters at some point or another in an asylum application. Lots of people were saying there'd been some type of issue, whatever it was. And with my background in forensic linguistics, I thought, let's take a look at this. So I'm always looking at this from a sort of legal linguistic perspective. How is language interacting with the law? How is language being used as evidence? So just the process of seeking asylum in the UK.
Yeah, I think we better go through that before we go on. So
Yeah.
From what I know, there are 3 interviews. And the first one is once the person has claimed asylum at the point of entry, is a screening interview.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
What information are they looking for in this initial interview?
Yeah, so as soon as you arrive, whether that's an airport or any port of arrival, basically you have a screening interview normally with the UK Border Force, and it's supposed to just be really basic, gather basic details. So, your name, age, your country of origin, things like that.
Okay. And they would use an interpreter if necessary?
Yeah. They either have interpreters on hand at the port or there'll be a telephone interpreting service.
Right. So, they could have people with lots of different languages. They just have all those interpreters sat round waiting.
Yeah. Some ports will have set interpreters with set languages waiting, but I think on the whole, there's a lot of use of the telephone service. Yeah.
Okay. And then sometime later, there's a substantive interview by the Home Office.
That's right.
And that's carried out presumably in some sort of detention centre or something.
Not necessarily a detention centre, but a Home Office centre, yeah. And a lot of these interviews are being done online now. So you'll have a sort of Teams meeting with a Home Office decision maker who could be located somewhere else in the country. So this is kind of your big interview, your chance to tell your story about why you're seeking asylum. And it normally lasts about 2 hours. I think it's recently been extended to 2.5, but they used to last even longer than that.
And the Home Office person who's going to make the decisions, they have access to the initial interview
Exactly.
as well.
Yeah.
So this would be done, like I say, online with somebody from
Not all the time, but often, yeah.
The Big Word.
So I'll get to that. So basically, there's one more interaction to cover just before I get to that, which is that about half of all applications are refused by the Home Office. So after you have that substantive interview, the Home Office make a decision and send it to you. And as I say, about half of them are refused at the moment. So those people who are refused can appeal it. You then go to something called an appeal hearing at an immigration tribunal, and that looks like a courtroom setup. So there's on average 3 main interactions here to lots of asylum claims. And each different department that's responsible for carrying out that interaction has a different way of sourcing interpreters. So the Home Office have a centralised unit with a list of in-house qualified interpreters. But if they can't fulfil a booking from that, they will use the Big Word. And if the screening interview is the same, they'll either use that centralised unit or they'll use the Big Word. By the time you get to an appeal hearing, the Ministry of Justice, they have an exclusive contract with the Big Word, so all the interpreters will come from there. So what this means is you could you're very likely to have 3 different interviews for those 3 different interactions. And that's really key because the one thing that you're being assessed for above everything else in an asylum claim is credibility. So way more so than the sort of legal framework, they're looking for, are you a credible witness? And there's a few reasons for that. One is that a lot of applicants don't have documents with them because of the journeys they've had to take. Another is that, of course, the asylum system at the moment in the UK is operating within a culture of disbelief. So the onus is placed onto the applicant to prove that they're credible. And the decision makers are sort of looking for any signs of inconsistencies or to say that you're not credible. So you can see how if you have 3 different interpreters and 3 different interactions, that leaves you vulnerable to potential perceived inconsistencies. So translation is not an exact science. There's plenty of things that don't exist in other languages and cultures and they don't translate across, or subtle changes of words or tenses. And that could happen between interviews and it could look like you changed your story. And then particularly by the time you get to appeal, a judge will look back at that and go, hold on, you said this one thing here, this thing here, you're no longer credible. And that could massively affect the outcome of your claim. So these really tiny linguistic things can make a really big difference. And I can give you an example. So
Yeah, please do.
yeah. So I looked at one report of an appeal where now when you're interpreting, ideally you'd use direct speech. So that means you just fully take on the voice of the speaker. If you're using reported speech, you'd say, he said this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
These are methods of, the word interpretation, I think we all understand that in one context. Is it the same when you do it from one language to another? Are you taking what somebody said and literally word for word translating,
that's it.
or are you interpreting what they're saying?
Well, this is it. That's a huge question, which is kind of at the crux of this. So there's this idea in sort of legal documents and legal practitioners that you can act as this word machine, right? One word comes in, you compute it, another word comes out. But in reality, that is not possible. Language translation is not an exact science. It's much more nuanced than that. And there's lots of research done on it. There's lots of interpreting scholars who've published work on this. And there is no such thing as a totally neutral, invisible interpreter who can just be like this robotic word machine. It's just not possible. But what interpreters can strive for is to be as neutral or as impartial as possible. So one thing we do know that makes a difference is how interpreters see their role. So interpreting roles can be anywhere from an advocate and an ally to either side of the interaction, all the way to this idea of a robotic word machine. So if you see yourself as an interpreter, as an ally, and someone says something that doesn't translate, or that this other speaker clearly does not understand, you have a choice. Are you going to step in and say, okay, that doesn't actually exist in this country, so the applicant's not going to be familiar with that? Or are you just going to keep saying that word that they don't understand? So these things all make a difference to the linguistic evidence that is going into the case and the overall narrative, the asylum narrative that gets co-created, co-constructed by everyone in the interaction. So just to go back to that example with the reported speech, direct speech. So there was a case where a man was being interpreted about someone putting a receipt in a bag. And this was really crucial to the case. And one of the interpreters had done it in direct speech. So said, I put the receipt in the bag. Another interpreter had used reported speech. So speaking for the applicant, he said he put the receipt in the bag. This changed who'd put the receipt in the bag, right? So a judge looking at this said, hold on.
It introduces doubt, doesn't it?
Yeah, it introduces a new person.
He said he did it,
exactly.
rather than he did it.
Yeah, well, also then it brings a whole other person in. So the judge is going, well, you told me, you said in this place that you put the receipt in the bag, and then in another interview you said your mate did it. So which is it, And that massively went against that applicant. And we know that these seemingly tiny linguistic things can make a big difference. They can make or break a case. So for one of my studies, I took a random sample, right, of 30 reports written by judges after appeals. Literally completely random sample. And 2 of them had critical interpreter impacts where they were the basis of the appeal. And 13 of them, an interpreter had had a substantial impact. And so what I mean by that is something had come up during the case where there had been an issue flagged with an interpreter, changing the meaning or something, or some type of thing changing. And the thing is that this would happen in any instance because, as I'm saying, translation is not an exact science. Things are always going to change. But what's really important is that legal decision makers are aware of it. That's the kind of key message I'm trying to drive with my research, is that those who are making those decisions, judges, Home Office decision makers, need to acknowledge that this is happening and that it's a possibility. Because in some of the reports I found, some judges were kind of reluctant to accept that as a real reason for an appeal.
So you say that the third interview is done in like a sort of court of law.
Yeah.
So presumably there's some sort of prosecution and defence and
Sort of, yeah.
for and against.
Exactly.
Do the people who are speaking for the applicant, do they make what your research has discovered known to the judge to say there's a difference of interpretation here and what's happened is this?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you'll have a solicitor on one side with the applicant in the middle and the interpreter, and then the other side you'll have a Home Office representative. So it does sort of mirror, a court of law. So I know some solicitors that I've spoken to in my research that send along a second interpreter that they pay for to attend the hearing, to observe the court-appointed interpreter, interrupt and interject if they make a mistake. And basically that second interpreter has to sit there and monitor. And if they hear a mistake, they have to decide, is it worth it to stop the proceedings? Because the judge might be annoyed by that, or the judge might welcome it. You don't know. Are they going to write a note and pass it to the solicitor? And the solicitor will decide, okay, do I need to stop and say this has happened, or do I just let that slide? So the mere fact that that's happening, that the legal aid budget is paying for 2 interpreters to attend a hearing, tells me there's a problem here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is because as I'm saying, we'll never get a perfect translation for anything. That's not the aim. But what does sort of add to this problem is, so you mentioned the outsourcing, which the Ministry of Justice used to use a list of qualified interpreters based on something called the National Register of Public Service Interpreters. And to be a member of that, you have to have a level 6 qualification. So that's like a degree. It's a really high level. But the big word, actually, the list of qualifications is quite different. So, for example, they distinguish between something called a rare and a core language. And if you speak a rare language, of which there are about 152, you can actually interpret with very minimal training and qualifications. So if we have interpreters of different skill levels, that's only going to make this worse, because not only might there be subtle differences, but there might be actual mistranslations happening if they don't have the training or the knowledge. But
So for these rare languages, they're basically just looking for anybody who can speak that language, pretty much.
Yeah.
Can
Basically,
you speak this rare language? Yes, I can. Right. Interpret for this case.
I've read through recently the list of the Ministry of Justice sort of tables of qualifications required, and I think there's one which is almost none or 50 hours experience with no qualifications. And there is sort of a valid reason here, because some languages a qualification doesn't exist, but the requirements for experience or skill could be more stringent. And the key here is, I'm not trying to say there's any interpreters out there doing a terrible job, because this is very much not about attacking an individual. This is a systemic problem. I mean, interpreters are now dealing with incredibly low rates of pay, incredibly poor working conditions, particularly since outsourcing. There are all sorts of campaigns on and strikes at the moment because they're just being treated terribly. And so because of that, there's been a sort of brain drain where trained, qualified, skilled interpreters are leaving the profession en masse. In the UK, last year, there are about 100,000 asylum applications, right? And so if you kind of think about the amount of times this is happening. So I spoke to a solicitor, and they guessed in their cases, somewhere between 1 in 15, 1 in 20 cases, there'll be a serious interpreting problem. And in my study isn't representative. It was a small sample size. But if you look at, I just took a random sample and immediately had that many that flagged interpreting issues. You can see that something is going on here. So after the substantive Home Office interview, the solicitors I spoke to, as standard practice, bring their in-house interpreter in, go over the recording of the substantive interview and send off any corrections. So to say, right, that's not actually what was said, blah, 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 because they'll only obviously do that if it's crucial to the case, like the material outcome of the case. So We can see that there are things going wrong here. So what I'm trying to see is what exactly is going wrong and how could it be going just a little bit better. So my research, of course, I don't have any sort of delusions that I'm going to overhaul the whole system. Or, I mean, they've actually already put the contract up for tender at the moment. I'm not sure what the latest is, but they have said that they're still outsourcing it. But all I'm trying to do is make legal decision makers acknowledge that it's happening, so that if these issues are raised legally, then there is that sort of precedent there to say, no, we know it is happening for sure. Don't just dismiss this.
So it's almost like in another court case, you have expert witnesses called by each side.
Yeah.
So the Home Office would call their translator,
Yeah.
interpreter, and then the sort of the solicitor for the applicant call theirs, and the judge has to sort of make a decision between the two.
And actually that does happen. I mean, forensic linguists are hired to say, maybe not so much in immigration cases, but certainly in criminal cases, to say, I don't believe this person understood this at that time because I've assessed their language. But there's this thing called language analysis for the determination of origin, or language analysis in asylum procedures. And basically, it's the idea that when there is an applicant who is saying where they're from and the Home Office doesn't believe them, they can administer this sort of expert test delivered by some sort of expert linguist. And they can have a conversation with them and say, right, I can establish exactly where they're from. This, even sometimes down to like which village, which whatever. And as I say, I'll let Paul tell you way more about it. But there's lots of controversies and concerns around the use of this test. You know, the way it's done, who's doing it, are they qualified to do that? You know, can non-native speakers really even assess it? But I mean, as me and you were saying the other day, you said, you know, you're from Wales. Having a chat with you, I don't think anyone would be able to just immediately know that. But then I've often got over my life that I sound American, Australian, whatever, depending on, I'm guessing my accent shifts. Who knows? It depends who you're friends with, what accent your parents have, where you lived, where you moved around, what kind of media you absorbed. Like,
yeah, it's like all these British kids who get that sort of uplift thing from watching Australian soaps and things.
Yeah, there's that as well. Exactly. So this idea that you can say, you can pinpoint where someone's from like that, and do that to have such a dramatic effect on them in their life. I mean, deportation is sending, it can be a death sentence. You know, you're sending someone back to an extremely dangerous situation. So just another point I wanted to mention was that some of my participants, I've spoken to asylum applicants. They're probably the most important voice of all in this. And some of them had enough of a level of English to understand that they were being misinterpreted in that moment, and then had to kind of make the decision themselves as to whether to interrupt and correct it or not. And that raises the point of how many people aren't even aware that these issues are happening. And one of the reasons is also that there's a dialect mismatch. So sometimes people understand Arabic to be sort of one language, but actually there are huge variations in different dialects of Arabic, and you cannot just hire one interpreter to cover them all. It's not going to work. Same with some Kurdish dialects as well. So that's another issue. And then one of the key findings from my research was that interpreters aren't routinely being offered a break. So particularly during the long substantive interview, which is like 2.5 hours, if they're not getting a break, is their quality dropping after about an hour? Because I mean, cognitively, it's a hugely taxing, demanding role. It's very highly skilled. There's also a huge emotional toll. And it's the interactional sort of power there isn't necessarily in the interpreter's hand to stop and say, I need a break. So potentially it should be someone else, the decision maker, perhaps offering a break. But the science isn't quite clear on how long it takes for quality to drop. But I mean, conference interpreters don't work for longer than 20 minutes at a time.
Right, I just thought, with interpretation, which way do you interpret? So if you're, say, a native speaker of English, but you've learned Arabic, would that qualify you to be an interpreter in this instance? Or would you have to be a native speaker of Arabic, but speak English as well? Which way does it go?
Well, it can go either way.
Right.
So you can do either. That they're not sort of stipulated in that. They more stipulate what qualifications you need to have. But I mean, there are some theories as to what's better, but I think ultimately you probably, they don't stipulate that. Just the level of proficiency you have is what's required. And basically, that's why this needs investigating. The stakes couldn't be higher. If we're not protecting people from a linguistic perspective, I think that really needs to change.
And do you think it will?
I'm hopeful.
So, before we finish, it's everywhere in the media, which is artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
AI. Is there a move, do you know of, to sort of get rid of this and think, right, we can't deal with two interpreters battling back and forth. Let's have an AI system that will just do it once and for all. We'll just feed it into the machine and it'll say yes or no.
Yeah, I think there's certainly some people pushing for that. So I know, since this contract for the public service interpreting went up for tender again, there's been a debate in government about this and in the House of Lords. And there is one Lord who is very keen on AI, and he mentioned it a lot when I watched the videos of the meetings. But it is just not there yet. There is just no way AI is capable of that at the moment. I mean, the issue of AI translation is a big topic in interpreting, but it is very clear that it's not about to replace humans. I mean, when you think about the type of things that are talked about in an asylum application, the idea that AI is ready to have that kind of level of cultural nuance is just not there yet. So I can understand that there are people questioning it, but I don't think it's a possibility.
Because I read on the Big Word website that they do use machine learning, as they call it, which is, but I mean, whether they use it for the Home Office contract, they don't say, and I don't know, of course. I don't think anybody does.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they've mentioned it on their website. So.
Yeah. I mean, the Big Word are doing lots of different new projects. For example, at the moment, they have a project to, one of my participants has told me, get interpreters to administer these language analysis tests to assess whether they're from the place they're saying they're from or not. And they have not been clear on what kind of training or qualifications they'd get for that. So for me, that seems quite a dangerous overstep of the interpreter's role to suddenly start making those kind of legal assessments.
Yeah, because an interpreter is not necessarily a forensic linguist.
Exactly. No.
So, Alice, at the end of all these processes, why is it so important that the interpretation is right first time?
Well, the reason it's so important to sort of work towards improving this is that it's not working for anyone at the moment. Interpreters, decision makers, and most importantly, applicants are being denied the right to tell their story. Behind every asylum decision is a human story, and the ability to tell that story is so fundamental into accessing your human rights to asylum.
So, that was all very, very interesting. I think there's a lot of points for discussion there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. So if you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to know more, point your browser to the University of York webpage at york.ac.uk and search for Book of Refugees. If you'd like to contribute or even appear on the podcast, please use the contact page. So all that remains for me now is to say thank you to Alice and thank you for listening. So until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.